The black surface of the reservoir always stayed perfectly still, directly above the drowned cemetery of Kestrel Valley. Even when harsh autumn winds whipped the rest of the lake into whitecaps, that one wide circle of water remained flat. Flocks of migrating geese would actively alter their flight paths to avoid passing over that specific patch of the lake. Fishermen learned early on that any line cast into that quiet zone would return cleanly snapped right at the thick hook. There was never any struggle or resistance, just a slack line and a clean cut that looked like it was made by blunt teeth. Sometimes in the deepest part of the winter, the thick ice would freeze clear enough to reveal the muddy shapes below. Most people who grew up in the area knew better than to look down when they skated near the old property boundaries. They kept their eyes firmly on the pine trees lining the distant shore, pretending the deep water was completely empty. It was much easier to pretend the town was gone, but the sunken structures were always waiting just 40 feet beneath the dark green surface of the cold county lake. Wade worked for the Regional Water Authority, tasked with keeping the massive intake grates clear of floating debris. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin built into the steep, rocky ridge that overlooked the southern edge of the dam. His morning routine never varied, starting well before the pale dawn light managed to breach the thick forest canopy. It would be another 2 weeks before he understood why the older workers always requested a transfer before winter. He would boil water on the small iron stove, fill a metal thermos, and walk down the steep gravel path to his boat. His small aluminum work skiff was incredibly loud and heavy, smelling permanently of stale fuel and damp, rotting pine needles. Late November in the Pacific Northwest brought a bitter, clinging dampness that settled deep into the heavy timber walls. The valley was always choked with thick gray fog until noon, making the opposite shore completely invisible from his dock. The isolation was absolute and heavy. Wade enjoyed the quiet solitude, preferring the company of the dense trees and the rhythmic sound of the outboard motor. His job required slow, methodical passes along the concrete dam face, pulling waterlogged branches from the safety screens. He used a long, solid steel pole with a heavy hooked end to drag the rotting timber away from the powerful suction of the pumps. Most days passed without him seeing another living soul on the miles of cold, gray surface that filled the massive valley. The first time Wade felt something wrong was on a Tuesday afternoon, dragging a particularly large piece of oak from a grate. He hooked the wood securely and leaned back to haul it over the gunwale, expecting the usual dead weight of soaked timber. Instead of sliding easily upward, the soaked branch jerked violently downward, nearly pulling him over the low metal side. He braced his boots against the ribbed floor, assuming the other end of the branch was simply caught in the metal grate. He could not possibly know that the thing holding the other end of the branch was only testing his strength for later. The dead weight vanished. Wade gave it one more strong pull, and the entire branch let go, flying up to hit the bottom of the small metal boat. He noticed a series of deep, parallel grooves scraped into the wet bark, looking exactly like wide fingernail marks. He convinced himself it was just damage from the industrial steel grate, tossing the wood into the metal holding bin. 3 days later, the identical resistance happened while he was clearing away a tangle of thin, submerged weeds. This time the tug on the pole was rhythmic, a slow, pulsing pull that felt entirely deliberate and carefully measured. The lake was too muddy to see what had hold of the other end, but the grip felt distinctly like 2 strong hands. Wade twisted the pole sharply, breaking whatever tension held it below, and hauled the dripping metal back onto the boat. The hook was wrapped in a piece of ruined black fabric that smelled overwhelmingly of stagnant earth and old dried flowers. He tossed the foul cloth back into the cold lake, furiously wiping his freezing hands on his work pants in absolute disgust. The wrongness of it settled like a cold stone. The worst instance occurred at the end of the week, when a dense fog trapped his small boat near the center of the lake. He killed the loud engine to listen for the distant highway, hoping to orient himself through the blinding gray mist. A soft scraping sound began to travel along the underside of his aluminum hull, moving slowly from the back to the front. It would not be long before he discovered why staying still in that specific spot was a terrible mistake. It sounded like a piece of rough pumice stone being dragged along the metal, pausing every few seconds as if listening. Wade stomped his winter boot against the floorboard, and the scraping stopped instantly, leaving only the sound of his breath. An old retired engineer named Gerald sat in the corner booth of the county diner, drinking black coffee every morning. Gerald had managed the original concrete pour for the dam, and he knew every square inch of the valley before it filled. Wade mentioned the odd resistance near the center of the lake, hoping the old man would blame it on strange underwater currents. The old man went completely and utterly rigid. The engineer stopped stirring his cup, his weathered hands pressing flat against the worn surface of the diner table. He told Wade that he had drifted directly over the old Kestrel Valley cemetery, where the bottom was 60 feet deep. Gerald leaned forward, lowering his voice until it was barely audible over the hum of the diner kitchen ventilation fan. He issued one very clear rule that he insisted Wade follow whenever the boat passed over that specific patch of quiet lake. If you ever drop anything into the lake above the old town, you must absolutely never reach your hand in to retrieve it. Once an object breaks the surface and begins to sink into that part of the reservoir, it belongs permanently to the drowned. Reaching back into the lake signals that you are willing to trade something warm for whatever cold thing you lost. Wade nodded politely, treating the warning like an old superstition meant to scare new county workers out of their jobs. That careless dismissal would cost him more than he could ever possibly imagine before the month was over. The bitter winter finally arrived. The freeze hit with brutal force that weekend, freezing the heavy dirt roads and cutting the lake off from the highway entirely. A massive ice storm coated the pine trees in solid glass, snapping large branches under the immense frozen weight. Nobody from the utility office could drive a truck up the winding mountain road, leaving Wade completely alone at the reservoir. The landline in his small cabin went dead on Sunday evening, providing a flat, static tone when he tried to call his supervisor. He was effectively trapped on the snowy ridge with no way to contact anyone until the county sent the heavy salt plows. On Tuesday night, a loud, rhythmic knocking echoed from the wooden pilings of his small dock at the bottom of the gravel path. Wade grabbed his bright yellow flashlight and stepped out onto the frozen porch, aiming the bright beam toward the open water. The dense fog caught the harsh light, turning it into a useless white wall that obscured everything beyond the edge of his property. The slow knocking continued, sounding exactly like a wooden boat bumping against the dock, though his skiff was securely tied. The isolation was now absolute and entirely unbroken. He walked carefully down the slippery gravel trail, the freezing air biting painfully at the exposed skin of his face. When he reached the wooden dock, he found a long trail of cold, freezing water leading straight out of the open lake. The wet trail moved past his boat, dragged across the frost-covered boards, and stopped right at the base of his gravel path. He did not yet realize that the terrible things waiting below had finally found a way out of their deep, watery grave. The frost on the wood smelled deeply of stagnant mud, rotting flowers, and copper, a scent that made his stomach turn over. Wade locked every door in his cabin, pulling the drawn curtains closed so he would not have to look at the black water outside. The following morning, he found an ancient, waterlogged ledger resting perfectly centered on the top step of his front porch. The ruined pages were completely ruined, swelled with foul, muddy silt and smelling like the inside of a closed storm cellar. He used a stick to flip the thick cover open, revealing rows of names written in fading black ink, dating back 70 years. The truth of the valley was finally revealed. It was the official relocation log from the county office, detailing the process of clearing the town before the valley was flooded. Beside every name in the ledger, someone had stamped a bright red mark, indicating that the grave had been moved to higher ground. But the final 20 pages of the book told a completely different story, one written in hurried pencil by a guilty hand. The county had run out of funding 3 months before the dam was scheduled to close, leaving hundreds of graves untouched. Instead of halting the project, the contractors moved the stone markers to the new site and left the solid wooden caskets in the dirt. They flooded the valley in the middle of the night, burying the evidence under 60 feet of deep, freezing water forever. The dead were never relocated, only covered up by the greed and silence of the men who built the massive concrete dam. Wade finally understood exactly why the quiet patch of lake above the old town center always felt so incredibly hostile. It would only take one small mistake to join the betrayed souls trapped in the mud at the bottom of the lake. The storm intensified, battering the fragile walls. He left the ruined ledger on the porch, stepping backward into his cabin and sliding the rusted iron bolt across the solid door. The wind picked up, howling through the pine branches and rattling the glass in his window frames with immense, invisible pressure. The temperature inside the cabin began to plummet, his small wood stove doing nothing to fight back the creeping, unnatural chill. He could hear the distinct sound of wet footsteps dragging themselves up the steep gravel path toward his front porch. The steps were unhurried, moving with a grim purpose that suggested they had all the time in the world to reach his door. Wade backed into the small kitchen, his hands shaking as he gripped the solid steel hook he used to clear the dam grates. The dragging footsteps stopped just outside his door, followed by the soft sound of freezing sludge dripping onto the wooden boards. Then came the terrible scratching, like wide fingernails scraping slowly down the length of the solid wooden doorframe. Wade knew he had to secure his boat to prevent it from washing away, a thought that pushed him toward a fatal mistake. He slipped out through the back window. He moved very carefully through the deep winter snow to reach the dock without being seen from the occupied front porch. The fog was impossibly dense down by the water, limiting his vision to a few feet of frozen boards and black, swirling mist. As he reached the edge of the dock, his foot slipped on a patch of black ice, sending him crashing hard onto his side. This single moment of clumsiness would be the catalyst for the absolute worst night of his entire adult life. The bright yellow flashlight slipped from his gloved fingers, sliding across the frost and tumbling directly into the freezing lake. He watched the bright beam sink into the dark green water, illuminating a cloud of dense brown mud swirling beneath the surface. Without thinking, he plunged his arm into the freezing lake to grab the metal light before it could disappear completely. The moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, a freezing, muddy hand clamped fiercely around his lined winter glove. He had broken the one clear rule Gerald gave him. Wade screamed, pulling back with all his strength, but the grip on his arm was like a vice forged from solid iron. Another pale, swollen hand reached up from the cold water, grabbing the fabric of his lined winter coat near the elbow. The flashlight sank deeper, its beam illuminating dozens of pale shapes swimming slowly upward from the sunken cemetery. Wade planted his boot against the wooden piling, pulling his arm upward with a desperate, tearing force that dislocated his shoulder. His glove slipped off, leaving the lined material behind in the crushing grip of the thing beneath the freezing surface. He fell backward onto the dock, scrambling frantically up the steep gravel path as the lake behind him began to boil with movement. He did not look back until he was safely inside the cabin, bleeding and breathless, with solid furniture shoved against the door. The terrible noises outside stopped just before dawn, leaving the valley wrapped in a blind, suffocating silence once again. A small county plow eventually cleared the road 3 days later, allowing Wade to pack his truck and leave the ridge forever. He never told his supervisor why he quit, leaving the key on the desk and driving far away from the massive concrete dam. The utility office simply hired a new young worker to live in the cabin and clear the rotting debris from the intake screens. Somewhere at the bottom of the reservoir, those pale hands were still holding his winter glove, waiting for someone to come back.